Picture's been on the screen for a bit. That's Lady Joe. Lady Joe's a T-51, which means that was a trainer. It's a full dual cockpit, front and back, instruments, and one of the obvious differences, if you see them parked on the ground, is the length of the canopy. It's longer than the others, than the standard 51. How this came about, in my airline job, we used to fly to Los Angeles, usually had a couple of days layover, and I used to spend a lot of my time hopping in a car and going out to Chino. Chino being just a little bit to the east of LA, and virtually the mecca there for restoration of warbird aircraft. And if people can remember back to the movie The Right Stuff, the cafe that was on the airfield at Chino, just like that, half the people in the cafe were pilots or engineers, and the other half were cattlemen, and it always stink of you know what. Be that as it may, it was a place that had a heck of a lot of atmosphere, and it was a great place to visit. Unlike our local authorities, you could get in a car and you could drive anywhere on the airport. Whereas, without being too derogatory, if you went through the gate here with your car and started following an aeroplane, I think you'd just about get locked up. But several occasions at Chino, I've been following an aircraft down the taxiway, taking pictures of it from behind as it was taxiing along. Absolutely frowned on in this country. But be as it may, I made myself known to the owner of this aircraft, Lady Joe, and I guess by badgering him a little bit and telling him what I did, he then offered me a ride, and I went for a fly with him south of Chino, and it was my first flight in a Mustang. A very, very memorable occasion. It was made better by the fact that he did a couple of rolls in the aircraft, and then he handed it over to me, and being absolutely unused to this thing, but the control column in my hand, I went to do what I thought would be a nice turn between a couple of big cumulus clouds that are around about 8,000 feet, and I realised that I had no idea of the radius of turn. I was aware that I was going to slide into the one on the outside and go IMC. I thought that was pretty dumb. And being reasonably au fait with aerobatics from the Christian Eagle here, I elected to do a derry turn. So I started the steep turn and then quickly rolled to the left and came out on the right. And the owner of this aircraft, he just came straight back to me. Holy hell, what was that? He'd never seen or heard of a derry turn. So I then had to show him a couple, and we went through some lessons of how he did one. And I was ingratiated with him after that, and any time I went to Chino, I could go and fly with him. Very nice. So that was the start of the 51 flying. Moving on, Texans, the immortal pilot trainer. Nothing else needs to be said, but nearly everybody that flew Mustangs in the wartime did initial time in the Texan. Named T6 Texan in most countries, but I always assumed there was 4 countries that called it the Harvard, being the UK, the Canadians, the Kiwis and South Africans. I was just reminded during the break that also Rhodesia called it the Harvard. So that was the Texan trainer. I had one here as well, and that actually, it's not mine, but mine was blue like that and was number 107. It went back to the States. It was on-sold a couple of times, and now it's in Prague. Lady Joe again. I chased up the owner in latter years when Bill Wiley was getting his Mustang, and obviously I needed to get my endorsement to fly it here. So I pursued the owner, and Lady Joe had moved from Chino up to Sonoma County, north of San Francisco. I did my check rides with both Arthur Vance, who was the unlimited pilot in the US. You could not fly at Reno unless you got checked out or got ticked off by Arthur Vance. And Arthur gave me my initial couple of rides in Lady Joe, followed up by his son, who was also equally qualified. And that's me sitting on the wing after my checkout, and obviously with a bit of a grin on my face and a thumbs up. The aeroplane, to fly it in Australia, you did need an endorsement in your logbook because of its horsepower rating, And so there it is. In May 2000, it was signed off in my logbook by Rick Seeger. Rick's not here today, but it was when he was in his Casa element. So then, cleared to go. That was Bill, the owner of the aeroplane. Not too sure what we're doing there. It's just an expression of Bill and myself maybe having just had a fly in his aircraft. Oh, you've seen this picture before. That was the Wiley collection and the crew that flew it. Flying the Mustang, that's really the meat of the matter, and trying to keep it reasonably technically free, but having to explain a couple of things. The Mustang is an aeroplane, like any other aeroplane, flies the same, except it is a superior war type and war era aeroplane of magnificent performance. It was always faster than a Spitfire, and it was faster than a Kitty Hawk. But coming back to flying the aircraft, what was it like? Sensational. Something I always wanted to do from when I was a boy, a little boy, and nothing's changed. So differences obviously come to mind flying the aeroplane, and I've got a few of them listed here, and I'll just go through them. The regular things when you go flying of any of these aircraft out here, obviously there's the normal things, checking the tyres, that it's all there, the maintenance is correct, it's got fuel, all of those things pertain to the Mustang. Coolants, it has 2 coolant levels to be checked, mainly the fluid for the cooling and also the oil. Going through, if one was about to go flying the Mustang, it starts even before you pull it out of the shed. Having checked all those other things, the first thing that's different about a Mustang, when you tow it out of the shed, the controls must be locked in the correct position. The reason being, the tail wheel is locked to the rudder pedals. And if you towed it out and pulled it through a sharp turn, you're going to break the lock pin. But when the controls are in the locked position, the tail wheel is disconnected from the rudder pedals, so it can swivel a full 360 degrees. So that's the very first thing that's a bit different about pulling the Mustang out of the shed. External specifics. Again, when you walk around, you've got to make sure that everything's there. Pitot covers are off, etc., etc. Fuel caps are on. Tyres are inflated, and makes it and look as though it's ready to go. There are a couple of specifics that will hurt you, very much so, if you don't get it right. Looking at the top of the wings, where the guns sit and where all the ammunition belts are, if those wing lockers are unlocked, they will destroy your takeoff roll because it just kills the lift off the top of the wing. So they have to be well and truly secured. The flaps are always left in the down position when the aeroplane's parked, and straight away one grabs the flaps from the down position and you check their integrity against the one on the other side just by pulling the up movement. If there's any movement at all, that can hurt you badly, because by putting the flaps down, you'll never have enough aileron. If they go down asymmetrically, you'll never have enough aileron control to stop a roll. That happened to Tsunami, which was a replica Mustang that was built for the Reno races, and the owner was flying it into his own airport, and it was being chased by a bizjet with video equipment, and at about 500 feet when he lowered the flaps, one went down and one went up because the mechanism broke, and it just rolled straight onto its back and dived in the ground. Most Mustangs, I shouldn't say most, all Mustangs, when they're parked on the ground, they should have the gear doors open. In other words, they're down. It's a very clever mechanism that goes with a Mustang. If the gear doors are down, like a big mousetrap, you cannot physically pull the gear selector handle up. So the gear handle cannot be raised to the up position if the gear doors are down. There's an interlock. So all Mustangs should be parked with the gear doors down. Inside the wheel wells also, there's a couple of other things to be looked at, because there's sequence valves and mechanical actuators so that things work in turn. Doors open, legs go up, doors go up and the locks are all engaged. It's interesting that if the aircraft is departing on a normal takeoff, when the undercarriage is selected up, the gear doors go up last. Once the legs are up in the wing, the doors shut, and the doors shut then and are mechanically locked. And the reason they're mechanically locked is that if you're in the middle of a sortie, for instance, take an example, say from the UK to Europe, the last thing you want is to lose the hydraulics and have the undercarriage doors drooping down. So they're locked up mechanically, and when you select the gear down, it unlocks the mechanical latch, the doors open hydraulically, the legs come down hydraulically, the lock pins go in to secure the legs in the lock position, and lastly the doors go back up and shut again. This time they're only held up hydraulically, no mechanical latch. There's a reason for it. So again, on this walk around that you're doing on your flight before you're going, you're just checking that the gear doors are down, checking the lock pin, and also as a buffer for the hydraulics, which all operate at around about 1,000 psi. In the right-hand wheel well, there's an accumulator which acts just as like a shock absorber for the hydraulics. Okay, some more specifics with the airplane. Having done all the walk around, you've got in, you're strapped, you're ready to go, starting it. It's different in as much as the aircraft is started without the ignition turned on and without any fuel through the fuel mixture lever. There's none of that to the engine. Fuel is introduced to the engine through a prime system, and it only goes to 6 out of the 12 cylinders. And the ignition is supplied on a different circuit through the starter. It's very much a retarded timing, so that when it does start, there's no chance of it backfiring. So the engine is started on the prime, and that's why you hear all the aeroplanes when they start, they pop a little bit for the first 1 or 2 seconds until the regular fuel is introduced to the system, and then they start running sweetly on 12 out of 12. I think the sound is still magnificent. So all up and running. The hydraulics have been reintroduced to the system. The doors would have closed, so you see the flaps on the start, the flaps retract to the up position, and the gear doors shut hydraulically. The vision obviously is inhibited because of that long nose and where you're sitting. So again, like a lot of aircraft tail draggers, it's a weaving process following the taxiways, left, right. That's done through the rudder pedals, and the rudder pedals will control the steering at roughly 15 degrees either side of the trailing position. So you get a fair amount of rudder pedal steering while you're taxiing down the taxiway. And when you get to the end and you want to do the seat turn or turn the aeroplane around, the control column is pushed to the very forward position again, just like you were going to check where it is when you were towing the aircraft out of the shed. And now the tail wheel's unlocked, and by differential brakes, you can pull the aircraft around in a very tight turn as you wish. The control columns return to the rear position, and as soon as the tail wheel's within that close barometer to 6 o'clock position at the back, the pin drops in and they're locked together yet again. Taxiing. We get to the run-up position. A run-up on a Mustang, again, is a bit different to other aircraft in as much as you do note the manifold pressure, and then the air, with all the coolant temperatures satisfied, both oil and coolant, the power is put up to 2300 revs, and you read off what the manifold pressure is, and it's got to be in a range within 1 inch of static pressure. If it needs to be higher than that, it meant that you had to push up more throttle to get the 2300 revs, in which case the engine is down on power. So it's a direct power indication of what the engine's doing for you. The run-up also, bit unusual in as much as the mag check like most aircraft, you know, we all have numbers for mag checks, and with a Merlin engine, it's different between left and right because some of the plugs are on the top and some are on the side. So one of the limits is 130 and the other one's 120. I haven't flown it for 7 years. You've got to forgive my memory. I can't remember which is which. One or the other. A takeoff in a Mustang. Again, obviously you've taxied onto the runway and it's in a three-point position. Power's introduced and away the aircraft goes quite quickly. And most operations around here, because the aircraft was only operated about 2/3 of its maximum weight, very rarely used maximum power at sea level. We saved about 10 inches. And next thing that happens, the tail comes up. And when the tail comes up, if you guys can remember any of the gyro principles, the big disc on the front being that 11-foot propeller, from the tail down it's in that attitude, and as the tail comes up, that propeller's gone to the vertical, and in standard gyro, wherever that pressure is on a disc, you rotate around in 90 degrees in the direction of the propeller's running, so the pressure goes that way, so it wants to turn the aeroplane to the left. And it needs quite a lot of right rudder to keep it somewhere near the centre line. Unusual to most airplanes, but again, I guess because of the amount of power, the weight and the size and the RPM of the propeller, gyroscopic effect. It catches you out the first couple of goes, and after that you get used to it with rudder, but it does need a lot. In flight, what a great aeroplane. Cloud chasing, just all the superlatives don't do it justice. It was just a lovely aeroplane to fly. And really, unless you did something extremely silly or very slow, it had little or no vices. It was an aeroplane with lovely manners. Returning to the circuit, reasonably conventional, be it you're going to do a pitch out or whatever type of approach is done. The only thing that's different is if you're landing on sod or grass, generally you do a three-pointer. Landing on tarmac, wheeler, and then put the tail down after it's slowed down a wee bit. And the only restriction there is you do not touch the brakes until the tail wheel's on the ground. Returning to one's doorstep to shut down, again slightly different in as much as you increase the RPM to about 1300 nominally, and then the fuel has just gone to idle cutoff. And by putting the RPM up to about 1300 before the cut, it does two things. It clears any fouling that may have occurred on the plugs from the taxi in, and it also gives a very nice clean cut on the fuel to shut it down. When it's shut down, when the prop stopped, the ignition is turned off, and with everything clear left and right at the back, the flaps are lowered, and that soaks up most of the hydraulic pressure that's in the accumulator, in the reservoir. And the last thing, there's a thing called the T-handle, and the T-handle is pulled and that dumps all the remaining pressure in the hydraulic system. And because those gear doors are only held up hydraulically now, they droop, and you'll see most Mustangs, if they've been shut down correctly, they're parked with the gear doors and the flaps down. And once again, with those gear doors down, you cannot physically select the gear up in the cockpit. Flying the Mustang, lovely aeroplane. Feel very privileged to have had a go at it with Bill. A couple of things, that was just a sample flying sequence, nothing too dramatic there. High speed runs, slow speeds, turns, and a couple of rolls before bringing it back to land. Nothing just a sample of a sequence. Speeds in knots for the aircraft. Again, nothing too special there. All aeroplanes have got a list of speeds. That was a shot taken on Australia Day alongside a business jet just over Coburn Sound, and obviously it was just before sundown. It was rather a nice shot. This was the aftermath of a flight we did on Bill's 70th birthday, and the guy that's standing up was an old friend of his from Hong Kong, and he came down here for Bill's birthday, and we went for a magic flight, and Bill was flying his Texan, and we went for a bit of a burst around the city and Rotto and before coming back. Bill's Texan, and a bit of a story to this one, in as much as when the Texan was still here, after the Mustang had gone, a gentleman, an American guy who was working in Sydney, he wanted to get checked out in the Texan. John Anderson was his name, and he used to come over here quite a bit, and we'd go flying together. And after a bit I asked him why he wanted to fly the Texan, because he told me then that in the States he had a Mustang. He got my attention. Okay, so this was his aeroplane, and I never saw it like that. It had gone through several owners, and that particular one, it had gone to Canada, and the owner had really decked it out like a hot rod. The inside was red leather, and it was very fancy, and obviously that paint scheme, all black with the white lightning strike down the side, and I think it had white tips here and there. Very coincidentally, when my Texan got packed up here and went to the US, I was selling it through a renowned warbird company in Illinois called Courtesy Aircraft. And Courtesy Aircraft used this particular engineering group just out of Milwaukee to either pack up or unpack and put together various aeroplanes being moved around the world. And my aircraft went to this place in East Troy. And John's aeroplane just happened to be in the same shed being refurbished, and it was on about a 5 or 6 year refurbishment program, very much a back burner restoration, and he wanted it back to full military colours, and they'd done the interior, and where we're moving on to is that one. This again, flying the Mustang. This was absolutely brilliant. And the gathering of Mustangs and Legends was, as you can see on the bottom there, September 2007. It was just after Oshkosh, and I had been down to East Troy to have a look at the Mustang, and I knew the people well there, and I said, will the Mustang will it be able to fly in about 6 weeks? And they said, yes, it can be. We've got to do a couple more tail skins, but it won't be painted. And I said, who cares about the paint, as long as it goes? And so I registered for this gathering of Mustangs and Legends, and I'd asked John, the owner, and he was more than happy for it to go there. And so this was the event. And just going back to that one a little bit, so the gathering of Mustangs and Legends, airfield is called Rickenbacker, and it's in Columbus, Ohio, and it was about 400 nautical miles away from Milwaukee area. I had done all my homework to fly the aircraft from this East Troy. Oh, that was the first thing. When I was looking up to do all the flight planning from here, first of all I couldn't buy any charts because they're prohibited items, which seems ridiculous, and eventually I did get some charts, and then I'm trying to look up to do my flight plan from this airfield called East Troy down to Rickenbacker. I couldn't find it. All the little airports in the States, they're not called like East Troy. It was called 57 Charlie. Again, you'd have to do a decode. So, hooking up with a couple of other people who I knew would be going to this Mustangs and Legends, the Legends were the Tuskegee Airmen. If any of you have seen, used to be a film out called the Tuskegee Airmen, and they were the Negroes who flew in for the US Army Air Corps in the UK. And they did a lot of the bomber escorts, and they were the little red-tail Mustangs. So they were the legends, and the Mustangs, don't need to say anything more. The group I flew down to Rickenbacker with finished up. There was two lots of three. There were 6 ships, all solo, and I say it was a 400 nautical trip. And the beauty of it was I'd done all my flight planning and that, threw all that away, and just sat in. I was flying on the wing of one of the guys, and we just motored down over the countryside, and it was like a superb Cook's tour. There was a lot of weather around, but we got in that day on the Wednesday, and most of it came in the next day, and it worked out then on the airfield, 76 Mustangs, and never to be repeated. So that was the gathering of the Mustangs and the legends. And as you can see on the top of that, the final roundup. There's a book there on the table there. Please don't take it away, but you feel free to look at it. That's on the cover, and it's got all the aircraft in it, where they came from and their background. Going on with John's aeroplane, as I said, it didn't have any paint on it. And when I flew down with all the other guys, we were all allocated parking spaces. The fuel was all laid on by the organisers. And when the fuel truck came around, you had to fill in a fuel chit saying what parking bay you're on, what the aircraft registration was, and what colour it was painted, and what was the aircraft name. I was the only Aussie there, but I came up with the aeroplane name as the Ugly Duckling. And the fuelers came along, we flew every day, and the fuelers came along to me next day and said, "You're a lousy son of a bitch. It's not an ugly duckling, it's a naked lady." So from then on, this aircraft became the Naked Lady. And that was one shot up there parked. To say, we were there for the 5 days, 76 Mustangs. Only one out of the 76 didn't fly, and that was Stephen Gray's. He brought his aeroplane all the way over from England, and he couldn't start it. And anyway, they got it started on the Monday. The event finished on Sunday. He went out and did about a 5-minute flight, came back, and then they pulled it apart, put it back in the box and sent it back to England. But the rest of it was just magic. There's some more shots of John's aeroplane sitting there. And if you look, you can see the flaps are down and the doors are down. That aeroplane, that was an airborne shot. Most of the time we flew in 4 ships, 4 together, and we were following a B-25 twin-engined bomber that was set up as a camera ship, a Mitchell bomber, and it came from United Artists Studios, and a set of guns, it was all cameras, and we all had a turn at flying alongside the camera ship, getting various airborne shots. For me to fly in formation over there, I had to have the fast ticket, which is that formation and safety ticket. And again, how I achieved that was quite different, but there we go, as a wingman. There was another shot of gathering of Mustangs and legends. Me on the outside. Funny enough, the guy that's number 2 in that one, I forget his surname just a moment. That aeroplane was redone as an original aeroplane, including the fuselage tank, so no jump seat. And then later on, I understood that he bought a second Mustang so he could take his grandkids flying, and that second one had a jump seat. And the same guy has sponsored several of those aeroplanes that have been retrieved out of the Lake Michigan. That 4 ship, as we were there, what would happen then is, number 1, Moonbeam McSwine, he would move up to the number 4 position, and the one that's number 2 would slide in to be number 1, and so we rotated around and around. And we did that most days against the B-25. Again, I thought I was a kid in heaven in the toy shop. Just going back a moment to Naked Lady, John finished up, he was working for an American firm, and after the financial crash in 2008, he had to sell that aircraft. And the aircraft has now gone to Port Elizabeth in South Africa. And the people who have got it, unfortunately I don't have a picture of it here, he's redone it in military colours, and it's still called the Naked Lady with an appropriate nose art form on it. Lady Joe, back in Sonoma County in California. One of my flies I had in it, and a couple of our people here, namely Neil, I can remember Dave. A few of us went to Sonoma County, and we all had a fly with Dan, and I was lucky enough I was able to do a front seat ride with him again. He still trusted me. And that aircraft now, the owner of that one has since passed away, and the aircraft has been on-sold and is now up in Seattle. And that's about it. I suppose in summary, all I can say, I was very privileged and honoured to fly Bill's aeroplane. It was something I always wanted to do when I was a lad, and it harks back to being a Kalgoorlie kid. The Citizens Air Force used to come up to Kalgoorlie about once a month. I talk about paid cowboys. These guys would be the weekend warriors from Pierce, come up in the Mustangs to Kalgoorlie. Needless to say, have a pretty good time flying around local area and socialising, and then get back in these aeroplanes and fly back to Pierce on the Sunday. Beats the hell out of any flying clubs, because they got paid for it as well. But as a kid, I used to go down there on a bike, and then you could get up a bit closer and actually touch the pilots and clean the windscreen, and then they'd let you sit in it and have a little fly on the ground. And it was just something that I always wanted to do, was to fly the Mustang. Yes, I got the opportunity, and now I've done it. It's been half a dozen years or so back since that last flight. I've flown 4 different Mustangs, all a little bit different, but still great. And I look forward to my next ride, whenever that'll be, but we're all getting a bit older. Thank you. So any general questions?
Peter, was there a tail drag, a stepping stone between the Windjule and the Mustang?
The Windjule's got the same tail unlock system. Exactly the same.
Do you fly a Wirraway or something like that, a higher performance in the Windjule before you got to the Mustang?
Yes, yeah, the Windjule was first, obviously. And then, yeah, the Mustangs, yeah.
And nothing intermediate between the Windjule and
only the Texan. I flew the Texan, mine here, I flew it just about every day for a month before I went to Sonoma County, so I was way up to speed with all my numbers, and I was very lucky in as much as the owner of the Lady Joe was not an instructor pilot, so he couldn't do the checkout. But on the same airport was a classic gentleman called Arthur Vance. And Arthur Vance was maybe one of the Top Gun piston type guys in the US. You could not fly at Reno unless you got checked out by Arthur, etc. So I did a 10-minute ride with Arthur, with me in the back, just to see if I could fly. You know, I guess there were a few tyre kickers turn up. So I did this very quick flight with Arthur, and then he'd also pretty comprehensive. He had his own aeroplane as well, but his wasn't dual control. And so then we swapped seats, and he said, "So what's worrying you about this flight?" And I said 2 things: keeping it straight on the takeoff run, and starting it. And he said, "Well, my son Dan, he'll lean over the side with you, and he'll help you playing the piano with the switches and the levers, etc. Because, say, after it's primed and you start cranking it, and when it fires, you then got to get your hands down reasonably quickly onto the regular ignition switch, and also introduce the fuel to it, or else it stops." So he helped me with that, and then dear Arthur in the back, we went flying, and again, because I had been flying the Texan and was way up to speed on that, he just said, "You don't have any worries." And then the next day, I flew with his son Dan, who was equally unlimited, and Dan went and showed me a roll, and very cheekily, my roll was better than his, and he says, instructors should not demonstrate. When we got back from that, he said, "You're done." And so they signed my letter of authorisation. And at the same time I said, look, the aeroplane's serviceable, it's a beautiful day, there's fuel in the tank, can't we go again? So we went out for another half an hour. And it was a lovely part of the world because it was an old naval airstrip parallel with the coast in Sonoma County. And so I've been back there a couple of times, but nice people, nice little bit of history in my personal deals. The aeroplane that was here, FST, it had proprietary dual controls that were manufactured by Pacific Aero something or other from Chino, and the geometry on that was slightly different to the TF-51. TF-51 had beautiful controls both front and back. The one here, FST, they weren't quite as harmonised from the back seat. Again, because of the geometry of trying to do all the linkages, etc. But can't complain about the toys. Just on that too, Bill's aeroplane, its registration was VH Foxtrot Sierra Tango, and I suppose irreverently here it was always referred to as the effing serious toy. 2 o'clock. But one thing I wanted to mention about the drop tanks. The drop tanks obviously were used primarily for the operations over Europe to give the aircraft the endurance they needed. With those drop tanks fitted, you could not do any combat or serious manoeuvring. So the big deal is with the fuel operation was to use that fuel as soon as possible, because if you came into nasty conditions or opposition, first thing you had to do was jettison the fuel tanks. And the fuel, the way the system worked in the Mustang, the fuel that's fed to the engine, there is also a return line. The return line only goes to the left-hand main tank. So the deal was you always take, if you've got full fuel, you always take off in the left-hand tank, and obviously you make a little bit of space for the return fuel, and then you went to your drop tanks, and usually a bit at a time, so they're reasonably balanced, because they are outboard a wee bit, and you're talking about the lateral balance integrity. And the deal was to use them up, because as soon as you met any opposition, bang, you had to throw them away. And there was a lovely story about this young kid who became leader of a wing section after about a month in Europe, and he was dead keen to tell everybody what they had to do for them, and he led this element of 4 aircraft, and he forgot to change away to the drop tanks. And now he's in the middle of Europe, and he realised that his drop tanks are full and some of the other tanks are way down in quantity, and he was just praying that they did not see any German fighter planes, because as soon as he had to throw his drop tanks away, he was not going to get home. They did not see any opposition. He got home and obviously used sorted the fuel out by the time he got home, and he didn't tell anybody about it for about a month. And then he came out with the old, don't do as I did, but do as I say. Yeah, the drop tanks. I've often been asked before, I've never flown a full-size Spitfire, but if you're in a dogfight between a Mustang and a Spitfire, which one would you rather be in? And I don't think there's a real answer, except if it became a dogfight and one-on-one, the Spitfire will outturn the Mustang, but the Mustang will outfly the Spitfire. So the idea of the Mustang, hit and run, and it was faster, so the Spitfire wouldn't catch it. We've missed out on all those opportunities, haven't we? Thank you.